This morning is a really kind of special time to start off the second day. As we've gotten feedback from people this year, as we've looked at the Institute and evaluated it and so on, I've gotten feedback from lots of people. A couple of people I talked to said to me, Bill, we really appreciate the spirit of the Institute in terms of its ecumenicity and the fact that it welcomes people from a variety of faiths. But they also said, we'd like to challenge the Institute perhaps to be also, and we've done a little bit of this, to look more at intersectionality and to look at the ways in which faith communities and theology have words to speak to secular systems and support systems and advocacy groups and things to learn from them. And that people with disabilities don't live in silos that are just around disability, which we've been talking about in here in terms of special ministries. They are people who are impacted by housing, by jobs, by ethnicity, by sexuality, by economics, by powerlessness, people who often, as we say, are on the margins. And one of the kind of wonders to me always is when congregations and faith communities talk about working with the marginalized or trying to enhance diversity, that usually disability is not included in that conversation. And so part of the question is, how do we begin to say, not only to the various ministries of our congregations, but also to, in a wider perspective, to people who are talking about and committed to people with disabilities and their families, how do we at faith communities take a seat at those tables? There's still resentment in this country because the faith community begged out of the ADA table. And so the question is, and this is kind of what I've done all my life, which is mostly work more in the secular community, trying to say, pay attention to the spirituality and faith traditions of people with disabilities, because while it has for many, many people been a wounding experience, that's not the case as much anymore. There's a lot changing, and there's a lot, just because it has the power to hurt, it also means there's the power to heal and to help and to move towards what we were talking about in terms of that belonging. So our two speakers today are going to address some of those issues in their own particular way. We're delighted to welcome back Amy Julia Becker, who first spoke with us in Chicago in 2012 at the Third Institute, the first one outside of Pennsylvania. Amy Julia is an author of A Good and Perfect Gift, about the birth of their daughter Penny, who has Down syndrome, and another book about her. And our most recent book is in the bookstore on white picket fences, addressing privilege in a world where love. I don't remember the full title. Sorry about that, but you can say more about that. We loved having her in Chicago. I was intrigued by the title of this book. And by her experience in this and the way that her advocacy and writing about disability and thinking about that has led her to recognize that the margins and the ways in which many of us, including me, come from a position of privilege and really need to pay attention to what we do. And then second, after Amy Julia, is a person I just heard last fall, I think it was last fall, at the Association of University Centers on Disabilities annual conference in Washington. Andy Arias was on a panel and was the heart and spirit of that panel, and just struck me with his passion. And he said, in the midst of this, in a room full of 900 people who very rarely talk about faith in public, said, my religion is one thing that has held me together through my journeys and transitions. And I got intrigued by that and nailed him while he was desperately trying to go to the bathroom afterwards and said, can I be in touch with you? And he was willing to talk to me after that. And we're delighted to have him here. He has done all kinds of things, and in advocacy in the Centers for Independent Living in Los Angeles area, in California, and transition of youth to employment, which has been his journey as well. He now works for the Office of Disability Employment Policy in Washington. He's been an actor. He's a stand-up comedian, or sit-down comedian, I guess, stand-up comedian, and a variety. I don't know all the stuff that he does, but he's going to come and follow second and talk about some of his perspectives on, and you see the title in your program. So without further ado, let me welcome Amy Julia Becker.
Thank you, Bill, and it is really wonderful to be here and to be back. I can hardly believe that the last time I was at the Institute was in 2012. I'm getting old enough that time actually moves really quickly now. And it's fun to reconnect with some people who I saw then and have seen at other conferences along the way. So thank you for being here. And it's really wonderful to be able to be here and to speak today on this topic. As Bill mentioned, I've written a book. It's called White Picket Fences, and the subtitle is Turning Towards Love in a World Divided by Privilege. And a lot of people said to me, I'm kind of confused. Like, you've been someone who's written about faith, about parenting, about disability. What does any of that have to do with privilege? And to me, the through line seemed obvious and got to a point where I couldn't deny it anymore, in fact. I'm going to speak a little bit later about what I mean when I say the word privilege. It is a word that can actually mean different things, literally, in the dictionary, but also carries a lot of freight in our culture. But before I get there, I'll also just mention that I was out at Asbury University, Christian college in Kentucky, predominantly white and conservative school. And I was speaking with some faculty before I was going to address the student body on the topic of this book. And a number of them said, you know, we want to be able to talk with our students about these issues related to social division in our culture. And we don't know how to do it, because if you start talking about it, people just shut down so quickly, get defensive and start fighting, or just shut down in the sense of withdrawal, I'm not going to participate so quickly. How can we do it? And I said to them, you know, my suggestion would be to read the Theology of Disability. Because what the theology of disability has been for me is the theology of humanity, or theological anthropology, to use the seminary word for it. It is a way at looking at what does it mean to be human before God. And yes, that applies to this specific area of disability. I have a daughter with Down syndrome, and that is what her birth is what invited me into this world of learning from theologians who have asked this question, what does it mean to be human before God, through the lens of intellectual and physical disability. And yet what I've found is this has not simply taught me how to receive and love my daughter, although certainly there's that. This experience of understanding the theology of disability has taught me how to receive and love myself, how to receive and love human beings when I encounter them. When I encounter the older white man who has recently joined a Bible study I lead, and he seems very eager to take over the room. For me to say, what does it mean to love you? What does it mean for me to receive you as a gift instead of, as I did on Sunday, just try to shut you down? So there's a sense in which this encounter for me and this journey for me over the past 13 years of having a child with Down syndrome into the theology of disability has not been a narrowing of scope. It has been a laser-focused experience, and yet what it has actually done is it has widened my understanding of who I am, of who God is, of who our daughter is, and really of who the human beings I encounter every day are, and what it means to be in a relationship of love, of healing, and of hope with them. So Bill asked me just to share my story of coming to that place. That's what I'm going to try to do this morning, and look also at a story from the Gospel of Mark as a way to think about participating in the work of healing the social divisions that we encounter along so many different identity lines in our culture today. So as Bill mentioned, 13 years ago, our daughter Penny was born. She was diagnosed with Down syndrome about 2 hours after birth. So I had the experience that I think many parents have when confronted with an unexpected diagnosis, which was I had a simple love for my 2-year-old daughter. It was uncomplicated, and it was warm, and it was light, and it was easy. And with that diagnosis of a condition about which I really knew nothing, came a lot of fear. So it wasn't that the love went away, but it became a complicated love. It became a love that was also interwoven with fear pretty immediately. And you all know some of the fears that came up immediately for a 28-year-old new mother of her first baby in a hospital room, right? I had medical fears. I knew that it was a Friday night of a holiday weekend, and they had called in a pediatric cardiologist to do an echocardiogram for our daughter. And it turned out she did not need any sort of immediate intervention on her heart, but there was just that immediate medical, physical fear that I would not have otherwise had. There was also, of course, a set of social fears that I also would not have had for my child. Fears about names that she might be called. I remember so distinctly thinking about being a family at a restaurant and are people going to stare at us. Sense of what is our future going to look like, not just for her, but for us as a family. And I knew that even though I had a daughter who had been born into whiteness and affluence with married, educated parents, I also had a daughter who all of a sudden had been born into a history of exclusion. And that was something I had not experienced personally. I had read about it. I cared on some level as a human being, as a Christian, about the experience of exclusion that so many people faced in our culture, but I had not tasted it. And I'm not going to say that having a child with Down syndrome is the same as me experiencing the exclusion that many people do experience in our culture, but it gave me a window or a taste that I had not had before. And I knew I was entering in to a history of exclusion that had never been mine before then. And of course, layered into all of the midst of this was what I came to call ugly grief. There's some grief that I think is really holy because it is acknowledging the loss that ought not to be, the loss that is out of keeping with the fabric of creation and of the goodness of God. But there's other grief that exposes what people of faith often call sin, right? That exposes the ugliness in our hearts and our souls. And that was one piece of my experience as the mother of a child with Down syndrome in those early days, was seeing, I don't know anyone with a disability. I don't know anyone with an intellectual disability. I have one friend with a physical disability. I do not know anyone in this community, and not only is that in and of itself true, but there's a reason for that. As a person who has always valued the life of the mind, which I think is a great thing. I love books, I love reading, I love thinking. I went to Princeton University. I loved my time there. That is good. But when that becomes an idol, when that becomes a value system, when, as I was confronted with in the birth of my daughter, I become someone who values other people and myself based upon intellectual ability, then that's an ugly situation in my soul, and I needed to reckon with that. So my heart was waking up through this experience initially of fear to all of these different realities. The reality of a culture that has been built in many ways upon exclusion, the reality of my participation in that culture, even as her mother, but then also this question of, are there possibilities for healing? If we start to wake up to harm, that is the first step towards a journey of healing. So at first, I was aware of this injustice of exclusion. This is just a little example. I'm sure many of you have encountered similar things. When Penny was 2 years old, I called a preschool, and I was chatting with the director about my daughter and how the school had been so highly recommended, and would there be a place for her a few mornings a week next year. And eventually, I mentioned that she had Down syndrome, and the tone of voice on the other line of the end of the phone went from warm and open to closed and cold. We would not have a place for her here. I did not share any medical information, any behavioral analysis, any occupational therapist notes, right? She had not met my daughter. There was a categorical exclusion that she offered immediately upon hearing the words Down syndrome. So my heart was waking up to the injustice of experiences like that I had never had before. And I began not only to recognize the ways in which this exclusion was true and relevant for our family and for my daughter, but also for other people. I certainly knew that people of color did not have the same experience in this country as I did as a white woman. But that's a different thing than caring about the fact that that experience was different. I certainly knew that all of these, whether it has to do with economics or whether it has to do with education or whether it has to do with immigration status, I knew that there were social dividing lines, but I started to really care about that. And so at first, I really thought that for me to participate in healing the ruptures in our nation when it came to social division, it had to do with advocating for those who had been excluded. And I certainly believe that there is a place for that, and there's a tremendous amount of advocacy work that allies can do. But over time, what happened is I realized, as I was reading Theology of Disability, as I was getting to know my own child, I came to realize, wait a second, it is not only that I have things to offer you, but rather that you also have a lot to offer me. I started to examine my position, my social location as a white, educated, affluent woman, and to say, what are the values that I live by? Radical individualism, hyperachievement, pressure to perform, competition. What are the values that my daughter and the community of people, particularly with intellectual disabilities, are inviting me into? To value people over productivity, to value love over achievement. What if it is not only the harm of exclusion that I am facing, but also the harm of ostensibly the benefits of privilege? What if living, and if you look at actually statistical analysis of affluent white communities, what you find is there are really high rates of depression, anxiety, and substance abuse, right? And you're like, well, wait a second. That's what our culture says we're going for, right? Like you've got a big fancy house and a car, and maybe your kid has gotten into the college you want them to, and you're still anxious and depressed and drinking too much. And I have certainly encountered that in my own life. I've encountered that in the communities in which I have lived. And I started to see that the harm of what I'm calling privilege, of these social divisions, is not just the harm of exclusion, but it's the harm of a culture that values radical individualism and achievement and the pressure to compete and win. Because what that does is it distorts our humanity and it isolates us. It cuts us off from God and from one another, and it puts us into lonely shells. There have been studies, again, that have shown that one of the reasons there's these rates of anxiety and depression and substance abuse among privileged people is because of a sense of deep social isolation. When you can pay for the things that you need, whether that's a babysitter or a therapist or even sometimes medical care, it can isolate you from saying to your neighbor, I need your help. Can we give and receive from one another? Can we be woven together? And that is, none of this is to say, oh, all those poor rich people. It is simply to say that what we need as human beings is not bigger cars and better colleges and fancier houses.
Louder for the people in the back.
I can try to be louder. What we need is each other. What we need is a different value system. And what we need is healing. So, participating in getting a glimpse of the culture that has been the people who have been excluded, and being at the center of what we say is a privileged existence, helped me to recognize that privilege harms everyone. And it also helped me to recognize that when we're talking about social division, we talk about it in terms of politics, and we talk about it in terms of sociology, and we talk about it in terms of economics, and these are all relevant categories. But underneath all of that is a spiritual problem of disconnection from ourselves, from our humanity, and from God. And what usually we need when there's a spiritual problem is a spiritual solution. And that's where I actually really do believe that the church has a tremendous role to play in healing social division, because we do have spiritual tools. If you look at books that are being written, even by people who would name themselves as atheists, on the topic of race and justice and privilege in our culture, they often use the word soul or sin. There's spiritual language being used in this conversation because we don't really know how to talk about it otherwise. And again, people of faith, the church as a whole, other communities of faith have not always done this well. But we do have tools available to us now to participate in healing within our culture. I'm going to read a story that I imagine is familiar to many of you. This is from Mark, chapter 5. It's a story of Jesus and a bleeding woman. And I will remind you, I'm not going to read this part, but before Jesus encounters this woman, he has been with his disciples, and a man named Jairus comes up to Jesus and asks Jesus for help. Jairus is a synagogue ruler. He's a prominent figure in town, but his daughter is sick and is dying. And so Jesus is coming with Jairus and his disciples through town in order to go to Jairus' house. A large crowd followed and pressed around Jesus. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." I want to just mention a few things that I have learned from this passage about the nature of healing, and also suggest that this passage presents a model for how we too can be participants in the healing work that I believe God wants to do among us. So first of all, healing is holistic. It's hard to translate the words that have to do with health and healing in the Bible because the concept, both in Greek and in Hebrew, was really different than the concept in our modern Western English context. So we hear this story as a story of a woman who's been bleeding and isn't bleeding any longer. And that's true. But the word that is used twice in this passage to describe her healing, being made well, being freed from her suffering, the word is sozo. The word is salvation. So it's a spiritual term as much, if not more, than it is a physical one. So there's this conflation or relationship or complete interwovenness of the physical and the spiritual when it comes to this concept of healing in Jesus's mind and culture. And I think that's really important for us because we tend to divorce the physical from the spiritual and to think this is for the medical people and this is for the religious people instead of no. So in our culture, to be in conversation among the different fields in terms of what we have to offer, but also to recognize that physical healing, Jesus is not in any way content for this woman to experience the cessation of bleeding. Right? It's like, no, we are not done here. Not at all, because healing is so much more than that. We also see here that healing is social. In a very profound way, this woman who is trembling with fear when Jesus calls her out, because she knows she is not supposed to be there. She is supposed to be isolated. She is not supposed to be in community because she is unclean. And so she thinks Jesus is going to shame her, rebuke her. You're not supposed to be here, unclean woman, right? So she's trembling with fear. But why does Jesus call her forward? It's in order to affirm her. He calls her daughter, which is all the more profound in light of the fact that he's heading with Jairus to Jairus' daughter, who is in need of healing. So he affirms her in her personhood and in her humanity, but he does that publicly. He makes sure that it is clear to everyone who might be tempted to continue to exclude her that she has been restored, that she can worship again, that she can be in community again, that she can be welcomed back into the social and religious life. She is not simply physically healed. The other thing that struck me recently about this passage is that when Jesus talks to her, he says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." And we know already that it is power that has gone out from Jesus. That's when her bleeding stops. And yet he doesn't say, "My power has healed you," or "I have healed you." He says, "Your faith has healed you." And certainly, again, there's an empowering affirmation of who she is that's happening publicly in that moment. But there's also an invitation to understand healing as participatory. In no way to diminish God's power that is at work, but in every way to invite us to participate in the healing work that God is doing. And then the final thing that I want to point out about what healing is in this story is that Jairus is present for all of this. Mark mentions 3 times in this passage that Jairus is the synagogue leader. And any time in the Bible you get repetition, it's kind of like highlight, underline, star, and circle. It's like, hey, pay attention, pay attention. And so I looked at that and I thought, why does he keep telling us that he's the synagogue leader? And maybe it's simply for us to know that he's a man of stature and of status. And certainly there's that. Jairus is a man, he has a name, he has a house, and he's the synagogue leader. Like, he is the privileged one. He's also presumably the one who was excluding this woman from community life and from worship. And I thought, in watching Jesus insist on not going to Jairus' house right now, right? He's letting himself be interrupted. He's stopping. He's insisting not just on the healing, but on the encounter with the woman. He's insisting on calling her daughter. All of this, in some ways, is like in Jairus' face. And yet, what does he do? He does not turn to Jairus and say, "You should be ashamed of yourself." He does not say, "My healing is not for you, it is only for the marginalized." He goes with Jairus to his house, and he heals his daughter. And so that's the last thing we see here, is that healing is for all. It's for the powerless and the powerful. It's for the excluded, and it's for the ones who are in the center. It's for the marginalized, and it is for the people who are ostensibly benefiting from the power and privilege. Jairus and the bleeding woman both receive Jesus' healing, but the reason it's available to both of them and to all of them is because of this model of healing that we see in this passage, that we need to acknowledge harm. Jairus had to come to Jesus. So did the woman. We need to reach out for help and then we can participate in healing. And that's the pattern we see throughout Scripture, and I believe I've seen in my own life, that it is coming face to face with harm that is the starting point of healing. For me to look and not just see the ways in which I had participated in a culture of exclusion and bias, and to confront that harm, but also the ways in which I had participated in the harm to myself of being in an individualistic, self-serving culture of achievement. And then to ask for help, to ask in prayer, in connecting with other people, in getting to know people across whatever social boundaries exist in our lives, in relating to them, asking for help, and then and only then beginning to participate in healing. I want to conclude by reading a passage from White Picket Fences that talks about, I mentioned that there are different definitions of privilege, and this speaks a little bit to that. Our culture, when we use privilege as kind of a hot button word, we're talking about unearned social advantages and these social dividing lines that come up every day in news stories and in our lived experiences. But there is another meaning of privilege in the dictionary, the honor that it is, the undeserved honor that it is to know someone, to be with someone. And I want to read a little bit about beginning to understand that definition of privilege, especially through my invitation into a world that was not mine in any way until Penny was born, the world of people with intellectual disabilities. The way we typically assign privilege based on race or gender or religion or economic status distorts our humanity. It cuts us off from one another. But in times of hardship, I experienced a different kind of privilege, a kind of unearned beauty and promise and grace that did not emerge from anything having to do with wealth or education or ethnicity. When my mother-in-law was dying, I experienced the privilege of holding her hand while she slept, of singing when she was anxious and watching her body calm, of praying in the midst of her wordless moans and realizing that she needed her sons to be by her side when she died. It wasn't the privilege of social or legal status. It wasn't the privilege of affluence. It was the privilege of being singled out for something purposeful, being the undeserving recipient of the gift of human connection. It was that same sense of privilege that came when I talked to a new father of a baby with Down syndrome, and he asked me whether his daughter would ever know him as her father, and I could send assurance across the telephone lines. The same sense of privilege when Penny and I used to go to our local Panera for lunch, and a young woman who worked there would go out of her way to attend to us, offering free cookies and clearing our table without asking. One day she said, "Your daughter reminds me of my sister back in Morocco. I miss her so much." And suddenly I had more in common with this young immigrant from Morocco who understood my love for my daughter than I did with anyone else in that restaurant. "My sister's name is Doha," she told us. The privilege of whiteness and wealth can become a wall against the privilege of being human, loved not for status or performance, but simply loved, and able to give love in return, not because of obligation, but in grateful response to an invitation. I have been given much that I do not deserve, and my very real social privilege has cut me off from others as much as it has also made my life comfortable. But social privilege is not the end of my story. The real privilege of my life has come in learning what it means to love others, that love involves suffering and sacrifice and sleepless nights and tears and heartache and great gifts. It makes sense to talk about privilege in terms of access to private clubs and schools and bank loans and preferential treatment by authorities. It makes sense to expose the injustices of privilege and call for them to be rectified. But there is also the privilege of cleaning the wounds of people you love, of participating in healing and new life, of becoming vulnerable and needy and receiving love and care. There is another type of privilege privilege that connects instead of divides, that shimmers through the air like a line of light, available if only we stop counting the coins and look up. The deepest gift for me of the past 6 months as I've traveled around the country and spoken about this book has been that I have done that more often than not alongside someone else. And that has been people of color, people who have multiple different disabilities, people of different genders, of different backgrounds, different faiths. The gift has been that privilege of standing alongside people who, from the world's eyes anyway, are very categorically different than me, and recognizing how much we have in common that can allow us to celebrate our diversity and our identities. So again, this morning, one of the privileges of being here is to now turn this over to Andy. We got to speak on the phone a couple of times, and I am excited to learn and hear from him, as I'm sure you all will be too.
Thank you, Julia. That was awesome. I just want to make sure that people can see me, so I'm going to scoot forward without rolling off the stage, or that works too. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Andy Arias, and before I begin, I will say, since this is being recorded, I'm speaking from a personal capacity and not my professional capacity, so they can't clock me for that back home in DC. So yes, my name is Andy Arias, and I am LGBTQ, I am disabled Hispanic, and I am a man of faith. And I know that's a lot to take in, so I'll let you soak it up for a minute. You know, it's the first thing in the morning, right? Coffee's kicked in, but maybe that was a lot. So let's just take that in for a minute. I grew up in foster care. I grew up in systemic poverty. I would say, honestly, I was poor up until 5 years ago. And poor meaning, like, my economic status was, you know, minimal. I shopped at those bargain stores. I, pinched pennies. My budget was non-existent, because when you don't have any extra money, you don't really have a budget, right? You just pay your bills, whatever you can, and you work it through. And so this was my life up until about 5 years ago. And even in those moments, I would say that I'm privileged, right? I'm privileged for being up in front of you now, but I'm gonna go back a little bit and explain why I think I'm privileged, even though a lot of you are saying, oh my God, what's happening? There's a lot going on here. But when I was growing up, my parents didn't know how to be parents of somebody with a disability. Like many individuals, they were lost and confused, and they were Hispanic. And they grew up in a system of abuse. And so that abuse kind of spread to me in that respect. And so I was taken away from my family at around 6 years old. And I moved around quite a bit when I moved around about, I'd say every 3 years, different family, different people. And the way I adapted was prayer and my belief in something bigger than myself. My faith is what carried me through all of those transitions. And there were many people that I was with on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis that I had to adapt to. I did not grow up knowing about my Hispanic culture. When I first was like alive and around, I only knew Spanish, right? And as I moved into the foster system, I lost the ability to write and speak Spanish very well, so because I grew up with mostly Caucasian families. And that was okay, but it always made it very difficult to fit in wherever I was. I never felt like I fit in. I'm not this person's kid. I'm not real, right? I'm not true. And the way that I got through that was that I knew that I belonged to him, right? Him with a capital H. And he was my father. He was my everything, really. He was the guiding force of how I was able to make it through all these transitional pieces of my life. And I looked at my faith, not in a religious way, because I have to be quite honest, and I'm sorry for the pastors and the priests in the room, I do not like religion. Because I believe that religion right now, maybe not later, but right now is sort of a man-made construct in the way that they dictate rules and regulations to people, especially in diverse communities, right? In a sense of belonging and a sense of you are wanted. Many people, when I'm around them and they're from a really strict religious upbringing, they think I'm broken. They think I need to be healed. They think the divineness of their God will heal me and make me better. And I'm like, no, I'm good, right? Me and Jesus, we're good. He has had my back since I was 3 years old. There's nothing you can tell me about my faith that is going to shift, shake, or make me a different person. I love learning from people, but learning is different because when you learn, like Julia was saying, you also have to be willing to teach, right? You have to learn and teach at the same time. You can't teach someone and not be willing to listen to where they're coming from. It's a two-way street. So there's a lot of people that like to teach me things, or like to think they're teaching me things, right? Or like to think they're telling me something that I've never heard before. I've heard it. You know, I moved out of my foster situation at 17, and I was, in transition of who I was becoming. Like I said, I'm LGBTQ, and for the longest time, I thought, why would you do this to me, God? Why would you make me someone so different, right? I'm already disabled, and it took me a long time to accept that. I mean, I had 17 years prior, but it still wasn't, I had no pride in my disability. I had no messages of self-worth and being someone with a disability. And everything I heard from the church was like, oh my gosh, God can heal you. God can make you walk. And you know what? I told them years later, because I wasn't brave enough to tell them in that moment, God made me this way. Do you know what I got to do? I got to figure out why God made me this way and do the best of my ability to spread a message of love and acceptance for others. And that also goes with being LGBTQ, because I tried to pray the gay away. I did that whole thing where I was like, I'm going to pray, and if I pray hard enough, because I'm faithful enough, God is going to make me a heterosexual male. And I'm going to get married, and I'm going to have lots of children, because that's what I really wanted. I wanted to be a father. I still want to be a father. And it was one thing that I was like, God, why'd you do this? Why'd you give me these two things to deal with? It's not fair. Before 17, my life wasn't sunshine. It wasn't a rainbow. It wasn't always happy, but I made it through. And I made it through with your strength and your guidance. So why now this, right? Why do I have to deal with this? And you know what God kept saying to me? You can do it. You can do it, and I made you this way. I made you this way. And I didn't accept that. For the longest time, I said, no, you didn't. No, you didn't. This is a trick, right? I am not supposed to be these two identities. It's too hard. The world isn't ready for somebody like me. They're not going to accept me. They're not going to hear my voice, and they're not going to hear my message. I'm sorry, I always get a little when I talk about this point in my life, because it was really significant to me to hear from God, hear from my loving Father that everything that I was okay. And still to this day in this world, when we go outside these doors, that's not the message that Christianity as a whole brings to the table, right? There's groups of Christians that say we love everyone no matter what, and God loves everyone no matter what, because I know in my heart of hearts, God is bigger than the boxes we tried to put him in, right? The boxes that we put God in are for our safety. They're not for his, right? He created the heavens, the earth, and the universe, right? And he created me. He created all of you. There are no boxes of faith that he said, you must be this or you must be that. All he said is, follow me, follow my lead, my example, and I will save you. And then we created all these groups to keep ourselves safe, secure, and to give ourselves a sense of privilege and acknowledgement, right? We said, oh, we're going to be Methodist. Oh, we're going to be Catholic. Oh, we're going to be Mormon. Oh, we're going to be this. That was all us, right? That was us saying we want to be special. But by being special, we were also excluding so many people. You were excluding me. You were excluding other people of diverse backgrounds, saying it's not okay to be you unless you're more like me, unless you follow my example, right? But God is way bigger than all that. He created everything, and that means he created everyone. And everyone can tap into that energy, that love that God created the universe with, and make something of themselves. And that's something that it's not easy. So I'm sitting in front of you as a young person, but God really had put me through the trenches to get to this point in my life. So my childhood wasn't enough, right? He then had to put me in, surround me with people that didn't always have my best intention at heart, right? Because he said, you know, I'm going to create you this way. I'm going to make sure that you're safe, but I'm going to put you in some fantastic situations and see how you handle it, right? Now I have an understanding of it. I didn't when I was younger. I said, well, God hates me or God doesn't love me, because why would he love me if he put me in these situations? That was my young self trying to fight where I was in life. And then what I realized, what a gift, right? He put me in those situations because it was a blessing to me. Because without all of that happening to me, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be speaking on many other topics on a national level and having so many different people from so many different backgrounds hear my voice. I just finished doing a documentary for Amazon, so I turned it in this weekend, and I was talking about spirituality and being LGBTQ and being disabled, so it was perfect, right? Because I was finishing editing for them, and I was like, holy moly, I'm going to be able to use this on Tuesday morning as well. So it's kind of self-serving, right? Let's be honest. But one of the things one of the interviews said to me is like, you've been through so much, and you've held on to your faith so hard. And I was like, yeah, because I stopped listening to the voices of the humans that were telling me that I was wrong, right? We need to change the messaging that we give to people about God's love, right? It isn't accept my way and God will love you. It's embrace all and God still loves you, right? God, everyone sins, right? everyone has transgressions. Everyone screws up. That's human beings. We're not deities. We're not angels. We're not perfect, right? And where I think faith and religion bump heads a little bit is religion kind of wants to put you in that box of perfection and then see if you screw up, right? It's like, okay, you're going to be good. You're going to church every Sunday. You're doing this. But if you screw up, these are the major consequences. And, you know, it's funny because when I would screw up as a kid and even as now, God's always had me on a very tight leash, right? He said, oh no, Andy, you can do that, but that's not okay. And I'm gonna get you back this way, right? And I've said, no, God, I'm not gonna listen to you right now. I'm gonna do my own thing. But the consequences for doing my own thing have always been not so fun. And God's made it very clear. You should have listened to me. And I'm not saying following God is easy either, because I think that when we really follow God in our hearts, He holds us to a different standard, right? There's Christians that go to Bible study, that go to church every Sunday, that have the image of being a good Christian. And I have a home church that I go to. I sometimes go to Bible study, but to me, it's not the place. It's the prayer and the spirit and the way I treat others. That's how God shows His love through me. It's not how many times I go to church and how many times I volunteer and how many times I do certain things. It's my actions towards others, not my rigorous schedule of religion that makes me a good Christian. So I have a real big problem with religion sometimes. I'm trying to get better. I'm trying to love people that think very differently than me. I work in an environment where everyone pretty much thinks differently than I do. And every time I walk into a meeting, I'm always like, everyone's kind of nervous. They're like, oh, what's this guy going to say? And I'm always like, calm down. But that's God's love showing through me, right? That's God saying, these people are different than you, and I'm putting you in this situation for a very specific reason. I'm making sure that you both have a place at my table, and maybe you can come to an understanding. And I've been doing that for 3 years now, and it's been really amazing. It's been a blessing to be able to sit with people that don't agree with me. I love my friends. I love the people in my life now because they're my family. And I love it when we don't agree. And I love it when we go into places that we're horribly uncomfortable, because that's God giving me an opportunity to share His love with others in whatever capacity. I think that we get stuck, right? We get in a routine of what faith is for us. And I've never been in a routine because God every day shows Himself a little differently to me and gives me experiences that I can say, I belong, I matter, because I matter to Him. And that's the one thing about belonging and inclusion, because I'm bringing it back to the title. It's this, right? I hate the word inclusion. And here's why. Because then you're giving someone permission to exclude you, right? And the only thing that I exist for is through His grace. And He, from day one, has given me breath and giving me the ability to exist beyond the inclusion that people think they're giving me. I pay no attention to that. People think that it exists. People think they're doing me a favor by inviting me to their table and saying, wow, you belong. you matter. I'm like, I know, thanks. I'm like, I'm good, right? You can say that I matter and I'm important to you, great. But for me, it goes much bigger than that. I look at people not for who they are on the outside, I look at their heart. And a lot of times, people don't know what I'm doing, but when I'm sitting there quietly, I'm reading their energy. And God's giving me sort of a way to communicate with them without communicating with them, right? God has given me so many gifts. So when people hear my story about growing up in, systemic poverty and abuse, they're like, oh my God, you poor thing. And I'm always like, no, I'm good. My life has been tumultuous, to put it lightly, but it's been a really beautiful blessing, because I know that when people are forged in fire, they come out way better than lots of other people. And I'm not saying anything about those who have privilege, because now I have privilege, but not having privilege for most of my life was my blessing, because I had to fight. God gave me a body that is fantastic, right? I mean, it doesn't always work the way I want it to, but he also gave me a warrior's heart and a spirit that many people don't have. Many people would have given up if they had my experiences very easily. I'm always told, people try to inspirationalize me and try to say, wow, and you're not suicidal? You haven't tried to hurt yourself? I'm like, no, I haven't. And again, it's because of his grace. I've known from the age of 6, he's had my back. So I'm not putting this out into the universe, but there's nothing in my life that could get worse than what I already went through. And because I had him by my side at that point, I know there's nothing in my life from this point forward that I can't overcome or that I can't move through. Because he sort of does this whole little thing where he just lifts me through it, right? He lets me experience it, and he's like, you're going to get close to the fire, but you're not going to get burned. I'm not going to let you burn anymore. You went through your trials. You went through your tribulations, and you held on to me. And that, to me, is such a gift, right? That he said to me that I'm not Joan of Arcing this. I don't hear God. I feel him, and I hear his voice in prayer. So I'm not hearing voices. I don't want people to think that. Because somebody said to me, so you hear God's voice? And they were a clinical person, and I was like, okay, be careful how I answer this, right? And I say, during meditation and prayer, yes. But you know how God shows himself up to me most of the time is through other people. He messages me through other people, whether it's a priest, whether it's somebody on the street, whether it's a message of a speaker that I'm speaking with. Those are all messages from him. I know when somebody's talking for themselves and someone's talking God's word. There's a difference, right? I can feel it in my bones when that is God's message to me. And the message that I want to leave with you guys is that it's not me versus you. It's not me versus privilege or not privilege. What I've come to realize is that disability is part of our culture. Okay, I'm going to let that sink in a little bit. It's part of our culture. Every single person in this room will experience disability, right? And I know we all love our mortality, and we're all superhuman, and maybe someday we'll all have bionic hearts and bionic limbs, and we can live 100 years longer, but you all are going to be in my position one day. You're going to need walker. You're going to need glasses. Many of you already have glasses. Many of you are going to need assistance. So you're all going to be in my position someday. I was just lucky enough to get it early. Yay for me, right? But you're going to be here. And what I would want you to think about when you go back to your communities, how do you want to be treated? Do you want to be treated with respect? Do you want to make your own choices? Do you want to have your own voice? Because that's all people in my situation, whether it's now or later, that's all they want. So just think about that. And I think questions now? Yeah? You got a mic?
Yeah. And somebody can help me with the mic around. We had another mic. Where's the other mic? In the back, a couple people just have walk the mics around. He's got them right there. Somebody else? Keith? Okay. Deb, well, let's get you the mic.
Boy, that was well stated, I'll tell you. We've already been there, done that. My question, because my disability is not being able to see you, so I'm curious as to what your disabilities are. Certainly, it's not your personality. It's not.
Sometimes.
It's not your acceptance of who you are. It's that's all great. So could you just tell me a little bit about what everybody considers your disability?
I was born with CP, so I roll around in a wheelchair, and my wheelchair is like a little racing wheelchair, titanium. And so it's a visible disability, but it's, there's other people with disabilities in the room that I can see, and I can assume that we all get treated a little differently depending on how they're addressing us. And so I would like to equal that out for everyone, to not treat people with different disabilities differently, right? But yes.
I was just curious, not that.
Oh no,
it's all cool, but I just was curious.
No.
I would never in a million years guess you had CP.
Oh.
Your speech is clear as a bell, and I have experienced folks who you could not understand as well, and so I never would have guessed that.
Oh,
I did gather the wheelchair though, because you said something about not rolling off.
Not rolling off the stage. Yeah, CP I get. So for those that don't know about CP, just so you know, it's a brain injury situation, and it depends where your brain is injured, where it's impacted. Some people have severe spasms, but as you can see, my leg is kicking out because that's where my spasm happens to be, and other people have spasms in their voice, and other people have spasms all over their body, but they walk, so it just manifests in different ways to different people.
Thanks for sharing.
Thanks. Don't be shy.
Questions for you?
Hi. Hello? Hi. I just want to say thank you for talking about intersectionality, because it's something that we really need to start addressing, because we're not just the wheelchair, we're not just one thing, we're all a combination of a variety of things, and I really appreciate you putting it out there as openly and bluntly as you could, so thank you very much.
Amen.
In my work on undoing racism and racial equity, working with racial equity and white supremacy, white supremacist thought, the thought among that group never talks about disability. And the thought about that group is that racism is built into the economic fabric of our society. So you have slavery and you have the cheap labor of slavery, and you have prison industrial complex and such. And I want to know, because I would like to work on, the intersectionality, and I just want to know how. I don't want disability to get minimized and to take second place. On the other hand, I also want to be, I want to honor that the economic and political features of race and I'm speaking really of North America. Racism is a thing you kind of have to, it has its regional flavors. So my only experience is what is here in the United States. So in talking to an international group, that's kind of a tricky thing to do. But can I throw that out at you? Is that enough to run?
Yeah,
Okay.
and then on like your feedback too. I mean, I went to the Middle East to film another documentary in last November. And the culture in the Middle East, I went to Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Jordan, and Oman. And everybody asked me, everyone, why are you in hospital? Why are you traveling by yourself? Where are your parents? I was like, well, that's a long story. I don't think we have time for all that. But the assumption also was that I didn't have a job and that I was poor. And I was like, okay, all right, so they're here, I'm okay, and I knew, right? On top of being LGBTQ and that my head could be lopped off at any moment if I'm not doing the correct things, right? So but I like being scared a little bit. That's how I get my joy in life, is like conquering my fear. So I went, and the culture was very different, right? I felt like a different person because I had to mind my P's and Q's, I had to dress a certain way, I had to be very particular in the way that I spoke. But I think I led by some level of example, right? Because I showed up and I was present and I was there. And it broke down some of their barriers, right? About what disability looks like. I was in a cab from somebody from India yesterday, and he was shocked that I was taking a cab or an Uber to my hotel by myself. Ooh, and like that I lived on my own and that I worked and drove a car. And I wasn't mad at him. I understood it. So we had a conversation. So I think what you got to do is invite people in those spaces to be that example. That's the easiest example that I can give to you, because if they don't see it in front of them, they can't think it.
Right.
And that's a lot of people.
Yeah, I would also say that now the mic is on. So I think the word intersectionality is probably helpful in this conversation, even if we think about literal intersections. The way I've thought a lot about privilege is as a Venn diagram, which is another place of intersection. So for someone like my daughter, who is white and has relative affluence and educated parents, et cetera, and an intellectual disability, there's a lot in which her layers are advantaging her in our society, or our society is going to confer advantages upon her. And then there's this area in which that's not the case. For my friend Marty, who is a black woman who grew up in a family with married parents who, again, were educated and sent her to private school. She would say, on the one hand, I've had the experience of a black woman in America. And I mean, literally, you walk down that road and it gets her pretty far away from my experience as a white woman in America. And yet, we also have a road we've walked together as far as both the pressures and some of the harms I talked about being kids in private school with lots of pressure on us and relative means in the world. And I think that's where having these conversations, being willing to identify I actually wrote a blog post this year called "Why My Bad Experience of Barbie is Different Than My Friend Marty's Bad Experience of Barbie." But in trying to identify, like, as a white woman who ended up having an eating disorder, I would also say that Barbie was not helpful to me because of the image of what it means to be female. For Marty, as a 4-year-old child who was chopping the hair off of Barbie and wanting to chop her own hair off, like that, because of how much she was not reflected in this iconic doll, it was a different experience. So there was a point of intersection, and there was also really important to name the differences and not to pretend that, oh, I have a daughter with a disability, I know all about your life, right? Or there is, I think, also in terms of the economic and social systems that create patterns of exclusion for people with disabilities, I think there's an overlap between the history of racism in our country and a history of exclusion in these other realms, but that doesn't mean they're exactly the same. So it's trying to be careful, also trying to be generous, because we often will, in having these conversations, overstep or, misunderstand. But trying to be careful in saying, I can relate in these ways, but this part is different. What does it mean for us to have a common human experience out of which we can understand both the celebration of diversity, but also the reality of different experiences of suffering? Because, the experience of my friend who is white and grew up in a really dysfunctional home. She said, I never felt privileged because I grew up in a home where my parents were getting divorced and my sister was in rehab and there was fighting all the time. And yet I now can see as an adult that I structurally was experiencing privilege because my parents, literally paid for me to get out of the house and go to college and get an education, and now I have a different life. So on the one hand, I can relate, she was saying, to an experience of suffering and of dysfunction, but on the other hand, that was not within a system of suffering and dysfunction. So again, trying to distinguish and yet not shying away from being willing to name the intersections seems important to me.
The one thing I will say, just to touch on your point, is that I think we, as the people that are non-disabled in the room, you want to help, right? You want to feel good about yourselves. You want to help people with disabilities, or if you see someone less, I'm going to use the term less fortunate, even though I hate that term, less fortunate, you feel like it's your duty as God's person to assist someone, right? But here's the truth, right? Then there becomes a level of you versus them, right? So when you're really going to help someone, unless it's a dire situation, think about it this way. Are you doing it through God's grace? Or are you doing it to feel better about yourself? And that's a really hard thing to decide in that moment, but I always try to do things through God's grace and not to feel above anybody else. Because in the structure of disability, that's why I think the entire disability community is where we're at, is because people want to feel better about themselves, but by feeling better about themselves, they're lowering our status slowly and slowly, because we're less than they are, right? But that's a perception and a construct that we need to sort of get rid of.
So I think we had 3 hands go up at the same time.
I made someone mad.
So this question is for both of you. I resonate pretty strongly with your story, Amy, but I think what I'd love to know from both of you is what are the spiritual practices or personal practices that help you sort out, tease out what's the same, what's different, because for me, I grew up in a pretty dysfunctional family with a lot of affluence, and I have a lot of education, and I have 2 children with disabilities, and I found out that, and I identify as someone with a disability, and that way my brain works makes it very hard sometimes to tease out these categories, and then it becomes hard to even find words for the categories or remember later what I used to know. Anyway, I just wonder what practices that you use every day, both of you guys, and spiritual or personal, that might be helpful to anybody else.
So I have been really into contemplative prayer lately, and I do think the practice of sitting in the belovedness, Andy was speaking to this as well, just literally, whether it's using verses from the Bible or simply imagining yourself in, depending on your experience of parents, in the lap of a parent who is embracing you. Literally experiencing if it's possible, in a sensory way. I've thought about Psalm 23 in this way. He makes me lie down in green pastures, like that. He leads me beside the still waters, just that sense of God inviting us to rest, to wholeness, but like literally just trying in my mind's eye to pray and sit in that space. The other thing I'll say is that for me, at some point in the past 10 years, making a distinction between brokenness and limitations was really, really important in terms of spiritual understanding of humanity. Because as, again, Andy mentioned, we have sin in the world, and that is not of God, and it is what separates us from God, from one another, and that I would call brokenness, where it's like it is not supposed to be this way. And that can come out in the form of human suffering. It can come out certainly in terms of broken relationships, in broken sense of self, in evil acts and behaviors. But there's also limitations. And I think as a Christian, certainly I had conflated the two. I think this happens a lot in the church, where things that we just can't do, whether because of a disability or because I'm a human being. Like, did I really think that if I were made exactly as God wanted me to, I would be a superhuman who was so able to do everything that I was isolated from everyone else? If anything, what God does is gives us our limitations, and our brokenness comes when we try to refuse them. Because what we do when we refuse limitations is we isolate ourselves from other people because we won't express our needs. And we isolate ourselves from God because we won't admit our dependence. And so it's this really strange conflation we've done that if we can start to tease out, wait a second, is that about my broken and sinful humanity? Or is that just about my actually beloved but limited humanity? If I can admit those limits, it actually can invite me deeper into love, because it connects me to God and to other people in my neediness, in my vulnerability. And similarly, if I can receive other people's limitations as what they are, not necessarily as sin, but as limits, then what I have to give can be called forth, so that it's a mutual giving and receiving that happens. So that to me, that sense of humanity as beloved, broken, limited, and understanding the interaction between those things has been really, really helpful to me.
So I have a little bit of a different spin on it, but I love all your points. They're amazing. I pray a lot. I meditate a lot. Usually in the car, even though I'm still paying attention. I meditate in my vehicle, and when I fly, because I fly about once every month, and it's this thing when I'm up in the clouds and I look out the window, I feel closer to heaven and I feel closer to Him. But I pray and meditate at least 3 times a day, and I don't make it a devotion, right? It's not a rule because I hate rules. But whenever I need Him, I call Him and I say, "This is what I'm thinking about. What do you think about it? Is this the right way?" And for me, I don't look at God gave me another gift when I was younger, and since I was going through the tumultuous system of foster care, He said, "I'm not going to let you think about your disability for a minute. That's coming, but don't worry about it right now, because you have all these other kooky people to deal with, and so I'll give it to you in doses." So He gave me the gift of not thinking that I was disabled when I was younger. So the limitations I have in my mind about my disability, if I thought about my disability every single day of my life, I'd never get out of bed, right? I would never get out of bed and say, like, I'm going to live my life despite my disability. God just kind of wove it into my being and said, you're just going to deal. Don't worry about it. And I did, but that was through his grace, right? And I think whatever situation we're in, whether we're in an affluent family with lots of problems, and I've met lots of those, and I've been thankful I haven't been in those, but then they hear my story and they're like, holy moly, I'm glad I wasn't in your situation. But I think that if we invite God's grace into our hearts and our minds and we spend the meditation and devotion with him, we don't have to figure everything out, right? Because he'll do it for us. There'll be paths opening up to us that we don't even think about. And that's sort of what I like about being human.